sorcery is this?
2024 has been a fairly busy year so far in terms of big new releases, some of which have been stellar. It's also a year where we seem to be getting inundated with a lot of remasters too. We've already had the Tomb Raider trilogy, Star Wars Dark Forces, Battlefront and Bounty Hunter, a re-release of Doom a few weeks ago, along with upcoming remasters for Dead Rising, Lollipop Chainsaw, that Silent Hill 2 remake, oh, and Croc Remastered just got announced too.
That's not enough. I need to see more.
Which brings me to the very recent surprise release of the Castlevania Dominus Collection. This is the long-awaited follow-up to the Castlevania Advance Collection from 2021, and is an updated re-release of the 3 Metroidvania titles that were originally exclusive to the Nintendo DS. Also, apparently the term Metroidvania is confusing people now in 2024, and Castlevania is just its own genre. Weren't people calling Lords of Shadow a God of War clone in 2010? For those that genuinely don't know, the term Metroidvania was coined after the release of Symphony of the Night as a way to distinguish the different eras of Castlevania, before the term was more broadly adopted to describe 2D exploration-driven action games. So yeah, the term Metroidvania 100% applies to the games in this collection.
Worthy of the name Belmont.
Unlike the Advance Collection, that featured games I was very familiar with, the Dominus Collection has been particularly fascinating for me, as I've never properly played any of these games before, as they had quickly become expensive rarities in my early 20s, and I had never had much joy trying to emulate them in the past, thanks to the dual screen design of the Nintendo DS, and it's why I imagine there's been such a big gap between these two collections. This meant that I spent a bit more time playing these games than I did for the Advance Collection, as I wanted to see as much as I could before collecting my thoughts. So with that all said, let's explore the Castlevania Dominus Collection, shall we?
It's been a long time.
If you played the Advance Collection, the presentation of the new collection is virtually identical between the two. All the different region releases of the games are included here and are fully playable, along with all of the soundtracks and an extensive gallery archive featuring character concept art from each game, with the first 2 games having a much more anime-influenced art style compared to the other games in the franchise. The same quality of life improvements from the Advance Collection return, with the ability to create save states at any time you wish, along with the rewind mechanic that I used a heck of a lot more this time around, particularly during some of the late game boss fights.
Forgive me, brother, but my need is far greater than yours.
The biggest difference presentation-wise is how the games are actually displayed, and this collection gives a few different options. The default option is by far the most optimal, as it provides a decent view of the main action, while the corners of the screen display the map and status screens. But if you want, you can also choose a couple of variants, like this one that halves the screen with the gameplay and the map, or you can even opt for a display that is more faithful to the original layout of the actual DS console. I do have a couple of very minor gripes with the presentation, the main one being that I wish that the map screen was zoomed in just a little bit more, as sometimes I found it hard to read where save points were, since I tried to save health items specifically for boss fights during all my playthroughs. One minor gripe I had with the Advance Collection is still here, and that's how there's no options for pixel filtering, like you can use with emulators to tidy up the presentation a little bit. The artwork of the games is still striking, and I'm glad it's been preserved, but it still would be a nice option, as I imagine it can't be that hard to do if emulators are doing it.
He's out of line, but he's right.
Also included in this collection, similar to how the Advance Collection also included Dracula X, another more obscure Castlevania title, Haunted Castle, is present in the Dominus Collection. However, unlike Dracula X, which was just a straight port of the Super Nintendo release, there are 2 versions of Haunted Castle available here. One is the original arcade release, but more impressive is Haunted Castle Revisited, which is a full remake complete with new artwork, minor alterations to the level design along with rebalanced difficulty. It's pretty cool and unexpected to see such love given to a lesser known title in the series. I'm still waiting for the PSP title Dracula X Chronicles to get some kind of re-release or remaster, as I thought with the show Castlevania Nocturne being an adaptation of Rondo of Blood, now would be a great time to re-release it. But it's really the main 3 DS games that are the key selling point here, and these titles are fascinating both in terms of their gameplay and their place in the history of the Castlevania franchise. These 3 games wound up being the final mainline entries produced by Koji Igarashi, who had been overseeing the series since the famous Castlevania Symphony of the Night, before Konami decided to take the series in a new direction, which led to the 2010 reboot from Mercury Steam, Lords of Shadow, the first game I ever covered on this channel.
You made me what I am.
Each game is a continuation of the Metroidvania design that had been further evolved with the Game Boy Advance titles. This means that there is a lot that will feel familiar in these games. You have large, interconnected worlds to explore, plenty of monsters to fight, along with light RPG elements as you find new weapons and get progressively stronger as your character levels up through combat. Each game does feel unique in its own way, however, with ideas and gameplay mechanics that keep the experiences feeling somewhat fresh. Some of these mechanics wound up being repurposed too in Igarashi's most recent game, Bloodstained.
Take it away.
I'm on it!
Starting with Castlevania Dawn of Sorrow, first released in 2005, and is the direct sequel to 2003's Aria of Sorrow for the Game Boy Advance. Set 1 year after the events of Aria of Sorrow, the game sees you once again playing as Soma, this time going after a cult that resides in a facsimile of Dracula's castle, who seek retribution for Soma denying his destiny and not allowing himself to reincarnate Dracula. This is the game that I played for the least amount of time, putting in around 6 hours and getting just over halfway through it. And it's not because I think it's bad in any real way, it's just that it really does feel like Aria of Sorrow Part 2. The games feel extremely similar. The central mechanic of Aria of Sorrow, the tactical soul system, returns in Dawn of Sorrow and functions almost exactly the same way. Over the course of the game, Soma is able to acquire new abilities from the souls of defeated enemies. These vary from being able to fire different projectiles to summoning monsters to fight with, all of which require magic to use, while other abilities are permanent since they are required for traversal, like the double jump ability. There are a couple of new innovations, the primary one being the doppelganger ability, which essentially allows you to have 2 loadouts of soul abilities to switch back and forth from immediately while playing, an idea that the other 2 DS games incorporate in their own way.
That makes things far more interesting.
Just like in Symphony of the Night, you don't have one fixed weapon, and are able to find various different weapons across the game to suit your playing style, with weapons offering different attack speeds and damage outputs. However, similar to Castlevania Curse of Darkness on PlayStation 2, there is also a weapon crafting system, where the souls of particular enemies can be used to create more powerful weapons. I feel like this is a system that becomes more viable near the end game due to the rarity of some of the monster types needed, and because the shop sells fairly decent early game weapons if you're willing to farm for the money.
We better go slash some candles and save up.
The main new gimmick of the game is the magic seal mechanic, that originally required you to draw symbols on the DS touchscreen in order to properly defeat bosses. Here in this re-release, this mechanic has been modified to a series of button matching prompts, but it is still a bit of an annoying mechanic because if you fail the prompts, the boss regains a portion of its health back and you have to keep fighting it in order to try again. Obviously, this is where I highly recommend using the collection's rewind function to bypass this annoyance. There's a reason a ROM hack for Dawn of Sorrow exists that completely automates this mechanic, and its inclusion is likely a byproduct of being an early title for the system. The same way a lot of early PS3 games utilize the awful 6-axis motion controls. I'll definitely go back and finish this game at some point, but I do get the impression that Dawn of Sorrow isn't exactly the fan favourite in this collection, but by no means would I call this a bad game, and I definitely think it's a lot more accessible than something like Castlevania Circle of the Moon. Just over a year later, at the end of 2006, saw the release of Castlevania Portrait of Ruin, and I would argue that this is probably the most enjoyable game in this collection, at least in terms of difficulty balancing and the new ideas it presents, though I do think it stumbles a bit towards the end. Portrait of Ruin is set in 1944 and is a sequel to the Sega Genesis title Castlevania Bloodlines. You play as both Jonathan Morris and Charlotte Orlan, who travel to Dracula's castle, which has been revived by a vampire called Brawner, based on the real-life Romanian surrealist painter Victor Brawner, who is trying to claim Dracula's powers for himself, and has sealed away parts of his own power using portraits that contain alternate realms within them. Brawner is also the name of the vampire lieutenant you fight in the Lords of Shadow, a reference to this game I wasn't aware of when I made that video. With there being 2 protagonists in this game, the story is a lot more involved than the previous games on Game Boy Advance, as there are a lot more cutscenes this time. The banter between Jonathan and Charlotte is fairly amusing, and there's some decent characterization all round, even though the story is predictable. I don't typically play Castlevania for the storytelling, but I do commend the effort Portrait of Ruin put into the characters in this game, as I found myself skipping through much of the dialogue in Dawn of Sorrow.
That isn't important right now.
What really separates Portrait of Ruin from other entries in the series is the focus on playing as both Jonathan and Charlotte. Of course, it wasn't the first game to offer more than one playable character, as almost every Metroidvania entry has an unlockable character mode, and Castlevania 64 offered 2 playable characters right from the start. However, Portrait of Ruin really centers its game design around the partner system. Jonathan plays much like a traditional Castlevania character, starting with the Vampire Killer Whip, and is able to equip sub-weapons like throwing daggers, axes, and other projectile-based weapons, similar to sub-weapons seen in earlier Castlevania titles. Charlotte, on the other hand, is a mage character, with access to various different spells to unlock, some of which are offensive, while others provide status boosts and curative functions. She is also able to transform later on in the game in order to aid in exploration. The combat loop in Portrait of Ruin revolves heavily around this partner system of switching back and forth between the 2 characters, as enemies react differently to each character, with Jonathan initially being the stronger attacking character. But in my playthrough, I actually found Charlotte became fairly overpowered in the second half of the game. There is also an option to have both characters active at the same time, with you being able to command their sub-weapon or spell at will, despite the other character largely being controlled by an AI. I also think it was a very smart design decision to have the player health fixed regardless of which character you're playing as. This means that only the character you're currently playing as will lose health that can lead to a game over. If the other character is active as an AI, they have their own separate health meter, and they will leave the battle temporarily if they sustain too much damage. Another new mechanic introduced is the Jewel Crush, which are powerful attacks that can be discovered throughout the castle, and are executed while both characters are active, at a high cost to your magic points, along with a 5-second cooldown between attacks. It honestly is a really cool gameplay system that doesn't really take much time to wrap your head around, as it is still at its core a Castlevania game. I also have to say that I think Portrait of Ruin is a much more attractive looking game than Dawn of Sorrow. Compared to the more muted colour palette of Sorrow, Portrait of Ruin is really vibrant with its art style, and there's a lot more variety in the level architecture too, helped by the fact that the portrait dimensions in the game aren't set in the castle. There is also some neat looking 3D backdrops like in the Victorian level, as well as the castle vista here when heading up to the throne room. I kinda wish all 3 of these games had done more of this combining of the 2D and 3D art assets. I think it looks quite striking and showcases the scale of the castle really well. Mirror of Fate is one of my favourite games for this reason. It really took advantage of its 3D nature despite having 2D gameplay. And it's not as if this was impossible for the Nintendo DS, as a number of the Spider-Man games on the system were full 3D side-scrollers. But regardless, Portrait of Ruin is still a very good looking game, and I suspect the short development cycles is probably why they didn't try to change the art direction too drastically. Not to mention they were also working on the PlayStation 2 titles at the same time, which were in full 3D.
It has to be made from scratch in a very particular way, or else it won't work.
As I alluded to earlier, while Portrait of Ruin is a highly enjoyable experience, it does stumble in a few places. The partner system is really well executed in terms of the combat, however it feels a bit underutilized in terms of the game's puzzle solving. There's barely a handful of puzzles that revolve around switching between the characters, with the main one that comes to mind being this one where you have to switch back and forth between them to avoid obstacles while riding these bikes to destroy a wall. It could have been neat to have seen more puzzles like this. Near the end of the game, after beating Stella and Loretta the correct way to get the true ending, 4 more portrait dimensions are unlocked, and when I realised that these were essentially just mirrored versions of the previously explored portraits, now with slightly different background art and harder enemies, I audibly groaned. I don't know if this is a hot take, but my least favourite part of Symphony of the Night these days is having to explore the castle all over again upside down, so seeing a similar recycling of assets to extend the game's length was a bit underwhelming for me. It's not a major gripe as these final portraits are shorter versions of their original counterparts, so it didn't stop me from powering on through to the end of the game.
Well, good.
Overall, Portrait of Ruin is a really solid entry into the franchise, and I'm glad I've had the chance to finally be able to play through it properly. Whether or not it's the best game in this collection, however, is probably up for debate, but I do think it's the most easily enjoyable due to its pretty well balanced difficulty and fun characters. Which brings me to the final game in this collection. Released 2 years later in 2008, Castlevania Order of Ecclesia is a culmination of some of the series' best ideas condensed into one game, and after having played through it in its entirety, I think it's one of the best games in the franchise in my opinion. Set sometime after Symphony of the Night and following the disappearance of the Belmont clan, the Order of Ecclesia rises to try and prevent Dracula from returning, creating a triad of magical glyphs called Dominus, based on Dracula's power. After Dominus is stolen by a man named Elvis, the game's heroine Shinoa, who was intended to be the vessel for Dominus, now stricken with amnesia, ventures out to pursue Elvis and retrieve Dominus in order to prevent Dracula's revival. Like Portrait of Ruin, there is a lot more focus on the story in Order of Ecclesia, and this is probably one of the better storylines in the entire franchise, honestly. Elvis proves to be a very interesting and ultimately tragic character as the story progresses, and Shinoa's amnesia serves as more than just a plot convenience to keep the player in the dark, which is kind of heartbreaking as she slowly comes to realize that she's losing everything in her life because of her quest. I found her a lot more compelling than Miriam was in Bloodstained, and she had a voice actress, whereas Shinoa doesn't. I will say that like with Portrait of Ruin, I did kind of predict where the story was going to go with the corruption of the Order, much like how the TV series is very centered around the corruption of the Church, but it's a good story nonetheless.
No offense, but you are just a bishop. Excommunication came from a little higher up the ladder.
The core gameplay isn't all that drastically different from previous Metroidvania entries, with the central mechanic this time being the glyph system, that is kind of a variation and a fusion of the Soul system from the Sorrow games with the conventional weapon system of prior games. Basically, glyphs for the various different weapons and abilities are acquired from defeating enemies and completing different challenges, and require magic points in order to use them. This more or less functions like the stamina system seen in Dark Souls, where each attack uses a certain amount of MP that is quickly regenerated. Shinoa can also perform union attacks depending on the glyph she has equipped, and these consume hearts, much like sub-weapons did in earlier games. A few of the glyphs are crucial for defeating some of the game's bosses, like the Magni glyph, which Shinoa uses like a slingshot and is needed to leap over and avoid attacks from some bosses. A couple of the boss fights were reminiscent of the game's Shadow of the Colossus, which was interesting. The Grave Dorcas fight reminded me of the 10th Colossi that would dive under the sand to try and surprise attack you, whereas the fight against Eligor was mechanically very similar to Shadow of Colossus, requiring you to attack a number of different weak points that would finally enable you to climb atop it and attack its true weak point. This is kind of fascinating because Lords of Shadow would also feature boss fights that were very heavily influenced by Shadow of the Colossus.
Something tells me she has a part to play in all of this.
The big way in which Order of Ecclesia differs from the prior 2D games is the structure of the campaign exploration-wise. Instead of being set entirely within a castle, much of the game feels reminiscent of Castlevania Curse of Darkness, with Shinoa exploring a number of different locations across the countryside, from abandoned manors to skeleton-infested caves, and even across mountainous terrain. You're free to return to any of these locations whenever you want from the world map screen, with the central hub of the game being a place called Wygor Village. One of your goals during the first half of the game is to rescue the villagers hidden in various stages, some of who will then provide services like the merchant shop, and others who will give you side quests that unlock new items to buy in the shop. This is a mechanic that was more or less repurposed in Bloodstained as well. And what do you know? Wygor Village is also a location in Castlevania Lords of Shadow. Another reference that I missed because I hadn't played these games before.
What happened here?
Order of Ecclesia winds up being a fairly long game too, with my playthrough clocking in around 14 hours, whereas Portrait of Ruin took me just under 9 hours. What was most surprising was when you eventually reached Dracula's castle, this wasn't just some final location like it was in Curse of Darkness. The castle was legitimately the second half of the game. It's not quite as big as the castles from other games, but it was a lot larger than I was expecting it to be, given how many areas there were to explore before this point. I think the extra year of development for the game really paid off in its favour, because it offers such a rich experience of exploration without an ounce of fat on it, compared to some previous Metroidvania entries.
And if you fight me, you will die, like thousands of vampires before you.
There is one caveat to Order of Ecclesia, however, and to put it quite frankly, this is a really fucking hard game. I don't think I would go as far as to say that it's balanced like a Dark Souls game, but there are times where it almost feels like it. There are a few things that make Order of Ecclesia a lot more difficult than the other games in this collection. Enemies, generally speaking, are just a lot stronger than you from the get-go, but also there seem to be a lot more enemies scattered throughout that are only weak to specific glyph weapons. This is why the game has 3 separate glyph loadouts that you can equip and cycle through on the fly. So it can take a while to figure out the optimal loadout selections that also complements your playing style. A few of the early game areas also start with a boss fight too, like the prison and the lighthouse, which can feel a little bit cruel, especially the lighthouse boss. The other main way that Order of Ecclesia is more difficult is due to how the game has rebalanced the curative items. They now restore much less health than in previous games, and they are also a lot more expensive to purchase, making them feel a lot more precious as you'll be really wanting to save them for boss fights. Most of the better curative items are also hidden behind side quests too. I died an awful lot while playing through this game, and if you've never played this before either, trust me, the rewind mechanic is going to be your best friend.
And on the brink of utter defeat.
There is one spot in the game where you can grind for XP here in the Skeleton Cave, if you really want to try and mitigate some of the difficulty curve, but it will take you a few hours before you even get here, so regardless, the opening hours of the game are going to be tough. I think I might have found the difficulty in Order of Ecclesia off-putting if I played this when I was younger, but after playing through games like Bloodborne, PC version when, and Elden Ring, I'm almost inclined to say that difficulty works in the game's favour, most of the time. When taken as a whole, the combination of a genuinely good story and the unification of some of the series' best ideas, Order of Ecclesia is truly an exceptional game, in spite of its steeper difficulty curve. Is it the best game in this collection? I can't say, as I did also really enjoy Portrait of Ruin, but I can definitely see myself replaying this in the future. In fact, I think I'm overdue a series replay at this point.
Then do it.
The Castlevania Dominus Collection I think is a must-buy if you're a fan of the series, and it's something we've all been wanting ever since the Advanced Collection came out 3 years ago, so the fact it's finally here is just wonderful. It's really cool that we almost have the entire franchise readily available to buy and play on modern systems. All that's left now is the 3D games, with Castlevania 64 and Legacy of Darkness, along with Lament of Innocence and Curse of Darkness. Someone asked me if Lords of Shadow might receive some kind of remaster, which is an interesting question. Does it really need a remaster, since even in 2024 it remains an absolutely gorgeous looking game? The trilogy is still available on Steam, but next year is the 15-year anniversary of the first game, so who knows? I wouldn't say no to a PS5 re-release. But with that all said, this has been my exploration of the Castlevania Dominus Collection. If you have a particular favourite game in the series, do let me know down in the comments. I'm still working on that Jak and Daxter retrospective, because games just keep coming out. Anyway, stay safe out there everyone, and I'll see you all in the next video.